Hi and welcome to this video introducing our main animal guide for this moon, barn owl. Barn owls are such a magical and amazing creature that I feel a bit intimidated almost to even speak of them. So I'm going to do my best to share some of their magic with you, and as always you can kind of fill in the gaps yourself and find out things, and you'll get little messages and nudges from barn owl that will be, unique to you. I wanted to start by sharing a little story about a barn owl encounter. So we went for a walk last year, me and my partner, our little boy and our dog, and we went to Martindown Nature Reserve, which is one of our favourite places to go, and it's in some of the videos and things for this course. It's a really unique site. It's very wide and it's kind of also quite hilly. It rises up to some hills, it's got some forest, and it edges onto a lot of farmland. But the site itself has never been ploughed, so it's got a lot of wildflowers. It's also got some really interesting Neolithic archaeology, and it's a very ancient, magical place. And we'd been for a walk and it was getting dark and we were really tired, and that thing happened where the car just seems to be further and further away, and it was kind of getting darker and darker and darker. And we turned a corner around some hedges, and it was sort of like inky blue black. It wasn't completely dark yet, but it was getting there. And there was this incredible bird hovering and soaring and swooping over a patch of longer grass, and it was a barn owl. And I've seen them a couple of times, but I've never been so close. It was just like a few meters ahead of us, and the silence as it moved was breathtaking. And I'll share in a minute some of the mythology around barn owl, but I could totally see how they've become associated with ghosts and things, because that soundlessness almost made it seem like they existed on a different plane to us. It was almost like a couldn't believe your eyes kind of moment, because they were just so quiet. And if you've ever been around a pigeon or another bird that flaps, there's a noise, isn't there, that we associate with birds moving, and there was just none of that at all. There was just this totally silent white shape moving so elegantly and so beautifully and hovering around before it flew off over the fields. And we all just froze in our tracks. It was such a special, amazing, beautiful sight. And I love barn owls already. They are a very iconic and beautiful creature, aren't they? But there was something about that moment in the dark, and us all being there together to kind of go, oh, afterwards. It was really, really special. So I just wanted to share that with you. And if you've got any barn owl encounters or any other wildlife encounters, you can always come over to the Facebook group and share them in there. I love hearing your stories. It always makes me so happy. And then we're going to move on now to really diving into some of the magic of barn owl and how they can help us at this time of year. There are somewhere between 120 and 140 species of owls found around the world. The fact that it's not an exact number makes me really happy, because I kind of love it when we get reminded that we don't really know everything. We're always working on the best hypothesis, the most up-to-date information, and that might change. But it's somewhere in that ballpark, maybe 135-ish species of owls. There are 10 species of barn owls, which are divided into about 35 subspecies. And they are one of the Earth's most widespread owls, which is really cool. I just love the thought that people all over the world could be seeing these amazing creatures. They tend to avoid places that are extremely hot or cold or mountainy, and they enjoy kind of more temperate areas. So in the UK, we have a subspecies that we just call the barn owl. And I'm going to be talking about them as my local owl, but of course tune into your local owls, you can find out about them too. So the wings, the back and the head of our owls are kind of shades of gold and brown and buff with grey and black and white speckles on. And if you see a photo shot in daylight of a male and a female, that you can tell them apart. The males are more white and the females are more sort of buffy coloured. But if you see them in the dark, or if you don't have them side by side, it's going to be kind of hard to tell. So they're pretty much similar, and it's only their behaviour and things that are going to enable us to tell them apart. And then we're going to start doing a bit of a mix now of some owl facts with some owl metaphysics and some of the more magical aspects of owl. One of the words that I use quite a lot on this course is umwelt, and I'm not even sure if I'm saying it, pronouncing it correctly. It's a word that I've mostly seen written down and not really heard anyone else say out loud. But the idea is that every creature has their own sensory world, and that we all live on the same planet, but it's going to look and feel very different depending on what species you are. Even, yourself as an individual, we all have our own ways of seeing and being, but different species can see different colours and things like that. So there's this kind of beautiful opportunity, I think, to try and step into the shoes of the other beings that live on Earth with us, knowing that even in our most beautiful imaginations, it's going to be really hard to step in fully when there are ranges of colour that we can't see and levels of sound that we're never going to experience. So the umwelt of barn owl is really interesting. They have this beautiful, almost heart-shaped face that acts a bit like a satellite dish. So you've got those lovely black eyes that are forward-facing predator eyes, and this kind of slightly satellite dish face. They are very sensitive and their hearing is amazing. And one of the things that helps them hear, our ears are obviously on the level. Their ears are, the little ear holes under their feathers are not at the same height. And so they tilt their heads and move their heads around to help them to pinpoint exactly where their prey sounds are coming from, so that they can aim their pounces. Because although their night vision is really good, sometimes they're going to be hunting in long grass in places that they can't necessarily see the thing they're about to pounce on, so their hearing has got to be incredible. And hunting in the dark, sound is going to be the first thing that they pick up on when they're hunting for their prey. So they also, of course, they're an owl, so they have a much bigger range of motion in their neck than we have. So they do the head tilting to hear and locate sounds, and then they can also combine this incredibly narrow focused field of vision that all predators have with their close together eyes. They can use that across a very wide horizon and scan around. So there's this really beautiful combination of intense focus and changing perspective in order to make sure that they've got the best information. And that just feels very inspiring to me, the idea of shifting our point of view and just checking, just moving our head around and just checking before we make a decision or take a big chance or jump on something, to just take a moment to look at it from another angle. And for even, I'm just thinking as well, that summer can be this incredibly fiery time. It can become quite heated with a lot of activism and things. Thinking about things from other perspectives and new angles can be really, really useful and important. And I love that message from Owl. I just think there's this invitation and reminder from them to take a minute, look around, just check, make sure you're tuning in as best as you can. Barn owls live and hunt in open areas. They need kind of big spaces to fly. So they like lowland pastures, meadows, grasslands, fens and farms, places that might have some light, woodland, hedgerows, dikes and ditches, along of course with trees and barns to nest in. And they need plenty of places to hunt for small mammals. They tend to stay in the warmer, drier parts of the British Isles as much as they can, bearing in mind that we're quite soggy a lot of the time, but they're not going to be going too far up into like the mountainous areas. They're more of a lowland bird. And their main prey is the short-tailed vole, which is thought to be our most abundant mammal, which is good for barn owls. They also hunt brown rats, common shrews, wood mice, beetles, and sometimes other birds. And they are incredibly tied to the ecosystems around our farms. And they were recorded, they're in the kind of notes and observations of our medieval ancestors. They have been found in the fossil record here since the Ice Age, which was 11,000 years ago. So they're definitely an animal that our ancestors would have been very familiar with. And they're kind of woven into our stories and folklore. And they probably did quite well initially as our ancestors started to clear woodlands to make farmland, because it would have given them wider spaces to hunt, and the small mammals might have been attracted by cereal crops and things like that. But as farming became more industrialized, kind of from the 1900s onwards, barn owls really began to suffer. Pesticide use, as we ripped up hedgerows, as everything just became a lot more mechanized and a lot less wildlife friendly, barn owls' numbers really dropped. And the IUCN has a list of, they kind of keep an eye on creatures that are endangered, and they sort of like, they rank how our wildlife is doing. And for a while, barn owls here did drop onto the at-risk list. But over the last 30 years or so, just doing my maths in my head, conservation efforts have helped bring them back. So there's around 9,000 breeding pairs, they think, now. So that's really good news. They've been brought off of the worry list kind of thing, but they are still really vulnerable because, unlike fox, they are a lot more particular. They're a lot more fragile and vulnerable to changes in the landscape. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is, and I'm sorry that I'm laughing, I just find this kind of interesting as an aspect to barn owl, that they are on the like northern edge of their range here. So if you imagine like a kind of a swathe of places across the world that barn owl lives, they're pushing it a bit by being here, even though they've been here for such a long time. Our weather can be really bad for them. So a soggy summer means no hunting, because they're not waterproof. So you've got this incredibly beautiful, powerful hunter who isn't waterproof, and they're incredibly tied into the fragile web of life in our sort of agricultural and green belt areas. So there's this interesting sort of combination of power and vulnerability that comes from their sense of interconnection. So when the local environment becomes depleted, the barn owls suffer in a way that perhaps red fox doesn't. And then you've also got the fact that they sort of traded having waterproof feathers for being soundless when they fly. So they've got these incredibly soft, magical feathers that mean that they are silent when they hunt. But that's one of the reasons why they're not waterproof. So yeah, I just find that kind of, there's this interesting aspect to them around vulnerability and power and interconnectedness in the seasons. And I think that's a beautiful aspect to them. They are interwoven to our countryside, and when humans do better at managing it, the owls do better too. So all owl species are special within the kind of world of birds for being nocturnal. Most birds come out in the daytime, and the night vision of a barn owl is thought to be 50 to 100 times better than ours. And they can hunt in daylight too, so another time that you might see them is like dusk or dawn, when that kind of like this liminal threshold times when the light is fading or coming up and it's low. They make a range of really interesting, quite weird noises. They hiss and they shriek and they squawk. They don't make any of the kind of poo-poo sounds that are kind of like that we associate with owls. That's not a barn owl thing. These are a lot more squawky and squeaky. And I think that, along with the way that they fly silently, has really sort of tied them into a more mythical, spooky kind of side of life. So they also roost in churches as well as barns, and so you might see them flying silently or shrieking around a graveyard. So you can kind of imagine that our ancestors would have found some of that quite terrifying, and associated them with the dead and other worlds and things like that. And maybe they are more connected to magical, mythical otherworlds than us. I feel like that's an important thing to consider when we think about the unveiled of other creatures. We don't know what other energies or things they might be sensitive to. And at the same time, I feel like that also touches on kind of the idea of projection and the fact that sometimes when humans don't understand stuff, we have a tendency to label it as scary or spooky, but actually it's just its own thing. So we can get woven into other people's stories and dramas as the bad guy if they don't understand us, or if we seem otherworldly to them when we're just being ourselves. And the same as kind of vice versa as well. We can do that in our own stories too, and how we kind of project things onto others and misinterpret them. So I feel like that's an interesting little question from Barn Owl, is to just notice where you might be playing with projection a little bit. One of the things that I've noticed when I've been reading about barn owls is that quite a few people describe them as sedentary, which I think is a really funny word for a bird. But apparently, if you're a photographer and you go out to do some barn owl spotting, they spend a lot of time simply perching. And they've got that thing that you gain when you're a predator and when you eat more high protein food. You don't have to spend all your time hunting. You get to sit around. So which I really love. If you know me by now, you will know. And one of the themes of this course is kind of around being over doing. And it turns out that barn owls are really quite good at that. So even though they're amazing hunters and amazing parents, and they spend a lot of time rearing their young, they can also spend quite a lot of time just perching and just being, which, is very inspiring. It takes barn owls about 63 days to go from egg to owl. So they swallow their prey whole, and then they cough out owl pellets. I don't know if you've ever found an owl pellet under a tree, but it's like a really strange kind of grey lumpy thing. And quite a lot of my nature conservation friends love dissecting them. You can melt them kind of in water, and then you can identify their prey from the bones that you find. But the baby owls don't do that. They rip up their food, or their parents rip it up for them. And in spring, it's a really busy time for barn owls, and they might return to their nesting sites in barns or hollow trees or caves, and the male owl claims that spot, and then the female owls turn up, and they breed in May, depending on very much how the climate is and how many voles are around. They can lay 2 clutches of eggs, which they incubate for about a month, and they hatch generally from June. Their first chicks to hatch are the ones most likely to survive, and after 2 to 3 weeks of being in the nest and being fed, they start to be able to do this really gross, amazing thing of swallowing their prey whole. So they'll then start to gain their flight feathers. Instead of being white and fluffy, they leave the nest and then they'll start to fly. And after they fledge, the young owls will be brought food for a little while by their parents before they master their hunting skills and they disperse into the local area. So summer is hopefully a time of hunting in the warmer dusks and dawns, eating well. There'll be more of an abundance of small mammals around, and they'll be feeding their young, and the young will be mastering flying and hunting. But this really depends on the weather and what's, as we've spoken about, what's going on locally, and it depends how much food is available in a local area as to how big their territory will be. They can end up being quite close together if there's a lot of food around. And the voles don't hibernate, so although autumn and winter is a quieter time for barn owls, providing it's not too cold or too wet, and there are plenty of voles around, they hopefully, fingers crossed, make it through the winter, and then do it all again in the next spring. So there are these amazing, sensitive, beautiful beings that hover through our landscape and hunt small mammals. They are really deeply tied to the environment around them and the web of life. And then we're going to move on now to learning a little bit more about them from a kind of mythical folklore type of perspective. Owls in general have so many different ways of being seen by us and so many symbols and associations that it's almost a little bit intimidating. So I'm going to touch on some of the things that I've been thinking about and that I found in my research, with the invitation for you, of course, to go deeper on anything that, pricks your ears up and makes you feel like, ooh, I'd like to know more. So I find it really interesting. We have this very long history of living with owls, and there are a lot of stories that tie them to things that we now would label as negative: darkness and death and destruction and war. And it's interesting to me because actually in our relationship we're the troublemakers. We've had far more of a negative impact on owls than they're ever going to have on us, compared to fox, for example. They don't eat the things that we want to eat. In fact, they might even eat the things that we want to eat. But that hunting in the darkness, the silent moving, the screeches and screams, are possibly enough to have just, for our ancestors, to have just felt like these were spooky and terrifying birds, even though there was no direct threat to us. And I think also possibly because they are birds of prey. Within the bird world, they're kind of not seen as being so peaceful as a bird, as dove, for example. So maybe that's where some of this association with death comes from too, and that they bring death to other birds, and other birds would sometimes chase away or mob birds of prey and owls. I don't know if you've ever seen sort of rooks, for example. If a bird of prey comes too close to their trees, they all mob them and fly out and chase them away. So it's possible, that we looked at relationships within the bird world and we're kind of like, well, the birds of prey and the owls and the barn owls are the kind of warry, fighty ones, and they're rejected, they're kind of outcast by their own kind. And it's easy, we can imagine that our ancestors, without easy access to light, with the world generally being more threatening and full of danger, would have potentially found barn owls screeching in the night, threatening. And at the same time, kind of on the flip side of that, I think it's really important. Got my own screech owls going on in the background. I think it's really important to imagine and remember that things we now label as negative and scary or dark even the idea of darkness has a negative association sometimes now, and it hasn't always had that, and it doesn't necessarily have to have that. Across time and in other cultures, you see other associations, and the way that we understand and appreciate death now is probably pretty rubbish compared to other cultures, and at other times even in our own history we're kind of separated from it. And so when we hear about a bird being associated with death, we kind of think, but it's almost like putting the death card in a tarot deck. We can also understand that death doesn't mean bad stuff necessarily. It also means endings, and it's a part of life and all of this stuff. So in Proto-Indo-European cultures, there was thought to be a cult related to owls and goddesses particularly, and it's thought that it predated the myth of the goddess Athena, who is often shown with an owl on her shoulder. I think it's a little owl that she's thought to have been associated with. And she was the goddess of wisdom, of course, and I think also war and truth and a few other things. And there are also Celtic stories with owls in that are thought to have come from these kind of Proto-Indo-European roots. And it's interesting to note that the goddesses in particular that were previously associated probably with life and death have become as well kind of viewed more negatively. So I've got a really nice quote here. Whereas the powers over both life and death were natural to the prehistoric goddess, her powers over death were feared by many of the assimilating historical cultures. And that's just, touching on that idea that at a certain point, goddesses of death became a bad thing when they weren't, that wasn't necessarily their root. And the ability of a Varn-owl to be able to hunt in the dark and navigate at times when we can't see is such an important symbolic and enviable skill, isn't it? And so they are also associated with wisdom and truth and clear seeing, because possibly because of their ability to move their head and tilt and all of the things that they would do to like hone in on their prey, and the fact that they can find their prey in the dark when human hunters would have just been like like it's inspiring and enviable. So there's a few little bits of stories and things that I wanted to just touch on. My pronunciation is going to be terrible because this is all stuff that I've never heard anyone say, so I apologise in advance for that. So the Gaelic for owl comes from the story of Blodwedd. I don't know why I keep saying the Blodwedd. Let's try that. And she was a Celtic woman who was created as a wife for a man called Lugh, and he'd been cursed never to marry a mortal woman, so a magician made him a wife out of flowers. But she didn't want to marry him. She had another bloke that she preferred, and she and her lover worked together to try and kill the guy that she was meant to be marrying, Lugh. And she was turned into an owl as punishment, and the Gaelic word for owl is still her name now. And she was condemned to the night, and that's where part of this aspect as well comes in around other birds hating her. Like she was kind of banished to be hated even by her own kind. A very strange thing that happened until it happened until the 1950s, which is amazing, is that owls were a dead barn owl nailed to the door of a church was meant to be protection from storms. And I suspect that there were probably quite a lot of dead barn owls around. In that as I mentioned before, gamekeepers would have been trying to get rid of them. I think it's possible that there was a list of animals that parish councils would pay you to kill as vermin, and I'm pretty sure some owl species are going to be on that list. So it's one of the things that in UK conservation, a lot of the species that are not doing so well, it's not just accidental. There were times when these animals were actively killed. And I kind of feel like that feels a bit like that. There's kind of like, there's this negative label on the barn owl, and so they get nailed to the door of the church to protect the village from storms. Owls often appear in stories, particularly or maybe the shriek of an owl appears in a story as a portent or a warning that a character is going to die. And even in the Aeneid, which is an incredibly old story, Queen Dido's death is foretold by owl song. In Scottish Gaelic, the word Cailleach means old woman, and Cailleach, I'm not even going to try and say that. And the word for owl has the word for old woman or crone woven through its name. And there's thought in Druidry to be this connection between owls and the crone aspect of the goddess, which I find really interesting because there's that kind of the wisdom of the crone, the association and understanding of death and sacrifice and letting go. Again, when you bring it back to a more neutral understanding and appreciation of the circle of life and appreciating the crone, we get to appreciate the owl as well. And the kind of connection between the crone and the owl is a really interesting one. And I also absolutely love this. Lilith is also associated with owls. So she is a Sumerian goddess and a bit of an outcast from the Bible who's often portrayed as a demon. She's loved, I know, by a lot of witches and seen as a bit of a feminist icon, standing for sexual equality, connected to the kind of the good sides of darkness and sensuality and choice. And there are depictions of Lilith as an owl, with owl feet, with wings, and with an owl as well. And this is my favourite thing, the scientific name for the little owl, which is sort of thought to be the owl that was the companion to Athena. This scientific name is Athena Noctua Lilith. So you've got two goddesses woven into the name of one owl. So there's tons, and that's just like scratching the surface. There's tons of meanings and associations with owl and with barn owl. I think the beautiful invitation here is to ponder what they mean to you, and there are a ton of journal prompts, and all of this information is in the ebook. So I think you can spend some time, if you feel called to, pondering, tuning into owl, thinking about this life-death life cycle, particularly in this last moon of summer. It's a really beautiful time to be thinking about that. And yeah, finding your own interpretations and remembering your own encounters if you have had any with owls, and pondering what they mean to you and any special wisdom that they're going to share that's going to help you in this final moon of summer.